I do have kind of a repeated theme slide that outlines a timeline of biblical history. My thought was I might offer that to you as a note-taking tool, but then I thought there's some things about it that I don't just love, but as we refer back to it, you may want to kind of think about, if you're taking a note or two, you may want to think about how different items, events, places fit within that timeline. I like it pretty well. I don't love the Egyptian rule and the Syrian rule way down here in this spot, though they happened there during the intertestamental period. And so we just don't get a lot of stuff from that. The real point is for us to understand the backgrounds for each of the biblical books so that we can look at them in a unique way and kind of gain some strength. I'm going to leave that because I see a few pictures being taken by phone. But let me just pray and thank God for our food and for this time that we have together. Lord, we are grateful, and we're grateful for food, but we're also grateful for the word that nourishes our souls and that tells us what you're like. And as we gather here, we're the first to recognize that there have been so many, throughout the generations, so many different understandings and interpretations of what was written. And so our prayer is that you would move us closer to your perspective of your world and your people, and how you want things to turn out, how we can step into your will, how we can be a process of the renewal of the whole earth. So we thank you and love you. Ask your Spirit to attend to us as we study and think together. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, if you got something that you think I said wrong or that you don't understand really bad, raise your hand and we'll fight it out together. But we are going to have a time at the end for broader questions. And so I'm just going to try and stay as long as it takes, and we're going to have, I think, some really spirited and positive conversations. Okay? I'm going to go back to I won't. I'll start here. One of the really hard things about biblical interpretation is dealing with the fact that the Bible was written for us, but not to us. Okay? So just think about that for a minute. It's written for us, for our benefit. It's inspired for our benefit, but it was not written to us. So when we open that 66-book library, we're reading someone else's mail, or we're reading someone else's story, someone else's history. We're reading about someone else's faith. Obviously, I believe the Bible's inspired, but it doesn't mean that understanding it is easy or effortless. I have a friend who says it's not a kid's book, and I kind of like that. You have to do some adult level work. I want you to think for just a moment about watching a war movie or reading a newspaper that was printed during war times, or a novel about war, and not knowing what war the author was talking about. It could have been the Revolutionary War, the Civil War between North and South, the Mexican-American War. It could be World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, the Cold War, Iraq, Afghanistan. Here's the thing. The accuracy and the integrity of your interpretation is it's essential. It's dependent on knowing what war you're talking about, because weapons change, they evolve, technology, communications change, battlefields change, strategies change, our allies change. Most importantly, though, our reason for fighting changes. And if you don't understand those dynamics, it's really easy to have a poor interpretation of what you read or see on the silver screen. Here's the other thing. The authors of the books of the Bible, they assume that you know those details. When you open that book, they are going to assume that you know some of the backstory. But truth is, if you casually assume that the reason we fought the Revolutionary War is the same reason we fought World War II, your interpretations are going to be way off. They're going to be very difficult. It's the same with the Bible. And so we're going to look at this kind of 66-book library. I think I may be missing 2 that I didn't get in there, so that doesn't mean I believe in an alternative canon. It just means I missed 2, if I counted right. Those books were written over a period of somewhere around 1,500 years, and many of them existed in oral form long before they appeared in written form. Genesis existed in oral form since the beginning of human history. So reading those books with 21st century assumptions and presuppositions and interpretive strategies, it's going to produce the wrong answer time after time after time. So interpreters have developed this process. They've outlined this wonderful schematic for what we need to do in order to better understand the text. This is from Scott Duvall and J. Daniel Hayes. They're both at Southwestern Seminary. They had been, I think, at Colorado Christian before. This is called the interpretive journey. The interpretive journey always starts in our town because this is where we live with our modern buildings and skyscrapers and roads. But the truth is, understanding, let me rephrase, the meaning of the scripture doesn't exist in our town. It exists over here in their town. What the writers thought, what they believed, the way they understood their world exists over here. So if you really want to get a handle on what those authors meant, you have to leave our town. We have to cross over this bridge. The bridge spans across to a different culture, a different language, a different time, a different situation, and a very different covenant with God, because those are where we derive meaning for the scriptures that we're trying to interpret and we're trying to encourage ourselves with. So we come over here. This is their town, okay? Our town, we cross over into their town with their way of living. The author assumes you live there, by the way. The author assumes that you know about their cities, about their farming communities. The author assumes that you understand about their form of government and their form or their attention to God's laws and the covenant that they experience with God, what they can trust God for and what they can't trust God for. It assumes you know about their neighbors, who are the enemies, as well as who is their allies, and how those all play out in the many crises that you're going to read throughout the Bible. So we cross over from our town to their town, and then we open the text in their town, with all those different dynamics of background and history and all those dynamics of society in their age. They think you understand slaves, what slave life is like. They think that you understand the difference between a free person and a slave person and different kinds of oppressors. So you come over here and you muddle around in their town, reading books and Bible dictionaries and commentaries and all those things. And then you get ready to come back home. But look, you can't just come home with the teachings that they received over there, because many times we don't have the same kinds of institutions or life circumstances on our side, in our town. So take, for instance, Leviticus 19. You go to Leviticus 19 and you're going to read this prohibition of tattoo marks. Don't tattoo your bodies. And you can easily say, I got it. I'm going to take that prohibition of tattooing and I'm going to cross over the principalizing bridge and I'm going to come home and I'm going to apply it and I'm going to boycott all the tattoo shops in Wichita and try and get them to close down so we can have a little more like heaven on earth. But then you know what you find out when you go over their town? Guess who did tattoo marks? Philistines and Canaanites. And they did it as symbols of the God that they worshiped. And so you start reading that and you recognize that what the author of those laws is saying is, don't do things that cause you to appear, unquestionably, to appear like the godless nations around Israel. Allow yourself to stand out as worshipers of Yahweh by not entering into the kinds of practices that you would call idolatry. And so you're like, oh, that's a principle. It's not just a one-off law. It's not as simple as simply not putting on a tattoo. It's got more dimension to it. And so you derive the principle from the teaching, and then you take that principle across the bridge and you unpack it in a sermon or a Bible study or just in the way that you live your life. So, for instance, if you were going to say, don't arrange your body, don't adorn your body so that it looks like you're worshiping an idol, now you've got something to work with. That can take all kinds of different forms when you come back to our town. I have good friends who in college got really swole on steroids. I mean, swole beyond all comprehension, amazing physiques. And the more and more I think about it, I just begin to wonder, if that's kind of an equivalent, if that's a principle, that if I would carry that across, I would say there are some points at which you begin to look like you're worshiping a different God. And I don't know. I'm not trying to make hard and fast conclusions about bodybuilders, but I'm asking different kinds of questions. There are certain things you could wear, certain things that you could perhaps arrange your hair like that would cause you to be perceived as worshiping a different God, primarily if you enter the skinhead community. If you decide that you're going to look exactly like the people in that community, I think it could be easy for people to think, wow, he's worshiping a different God. And I don't know. Again, I'm not trying to make dogma. I'm just asking questions about how we can derive principles that are broader and much more powerful for our age and our time. If you're going to break the Bible down, you can break it down into somewhere around 10 or 11 distinct periods. And we're going to do that as a way of creating unique contexts in their town for those individual segments. And the point I want to make now is that those 10 or 11 segments are learnable. I mean, they're not beyond you. You can kind of commit those to memory. And if you begin to understand the different cultures within their time frame and how God is responding to the crisis in that book, how his people deal with the crisis of that period, you will be able to derive meaning from those particular books of the Bible much more effectively, meaning that resonates with what was actually happening in their town. Then you principalize it, and we can carry it across the bridge, and we can be transformed into the image of Christ in our town. That's what we hope to do, get a little bit of God's kingdom coming down to earth as in heaven through the instruction we receive. We're going to begin with the period usually called the Patriarchs. What that usually means, when you hear the word patriarchs, what that usually means is the biblical story from Adam all the way up to 3 generations after Abraham. So, right, there's Abraham, then there's Isaac, Jacob. Jacob has the 12 sons, and then Joseph. Joseph ends up going into Egyptian captivity, and that begins a separate period that we'll think of as life in captivity in Egypt. So we're going to begin with those patriarchs. The period takes place entirely in the book of Genesis, from Genesis 1 through 11. So think about this. God creates man. We've gone over this so many times, sorry. God creates man and woman to rule in his image. They choose to rule the garden their way. They eat from the tree of knowing good and evil, and the result is the whole thing gets cursed, right? They get cursed. The snake gets cursed. The ground gets cursed. Offspring of the woman. There's only one hope, that there's this offspring of the woman who's going to crush the snake's head. Then the rest of the patriarchal period, all the way through chapter 11 of Genesis, is a repeated story of humankind's abject failures, followed by God making little tweaks, refining or restarting his creation. So Adam and Eve, they fail, and God refines his plan by kicking them out of the garden, right? That's quite a refinement. It's quite different than what the original intent of human beings were to do. Then Cain fails. How does God tune the situation? Cain is cursed to be a restless wanderer across the face of the earth. He tunes it up. The strange sons of God, remember them? They come down from the heavens. They're next. They come down. Their offspring is known as the heroes of old, the mighty men, and God tunes it up a little bit. He says, you know what? I'm not going to contend with human beings forever. I'm going to number their days to 120. So he seems to make some adjustments to his creation. And then after that, sometime the text says the entire population of the world is continuously evil all the time, except for Noah. Just that one man and his clan. So God sends a flood, and they restart the human race with a new Adam. If you look at the story of Noah and compare it to the creation story in Hebrew, there is so much borrowing of the exact same language of creation in Noah's story, right? The animals all come by Noah, just like they came by Adam in the beginning. All the animals that God created on this little floating Eden. And then when he gets ready to restart creation, there's all this language again that mimics the creation narrative. When Noah gets ready to restart, he comes out of the ark and he becomes the new first family of God's created order. Human beings next band together. They decide they're going to create this tower the story is very shocking. They're going to build this tower and make a great name for themselves. And God, again, restarts the human race in a way by confusing their language and scattering them across the face of the earth. So it's almost like, as you read, there seem to be these small refinements. But then when you hit chapter 12 of Genesis, everything changes. Because all of a sudden, the entire biblical narrative narrows down to one man and his family, his offspring. His name is Abraham. Again, it's the one faithful servant motif that you saw with Noah. This one man finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. And chapter 12 tells us about the next stage in God's plan. God is going to bless Abraham, and he's going to give Abraham a land. And the way he describes the land he's going to give Abraham, guess where it borrows language from? Eden. He's going to give Abraham a new Eden. So Abraham in some ways becomes a new Adam. At least that's what it triggers in the mind of the reader who knows the original language. I'm really scared here because I got a guy getting a PhD in Hebrew in this room. So, oh my goodness. If, Zach, if I'm like missing anything, just give me this right here, and I'll know then that's like, I need to back it up.
It's not Hebrew. I'll tell you that.
Oh, I thought it was Hebrew. My bad. I feel much better now. The entire narrative of the Bible zooms in and it focuses on Abraham and his offspring, Isaac, Jacob, Jacob's 12 sons. And all these stories involve trouble having children, right? So the guy who's going to have these children, as numerous as the stars of the sky, they all have trouble with children. And they all deal with deep mistreatment of their wives. They're living out the curse of chapter 3 of Genesis, or is it 4, where it says that there will be enmity between the man and the wife. Yeah. They all involve reversals of the older son's birthright, which then is taken by a younger son. So they have very common themes. Then when when his older sons sell their brother Joseph into slavery, recognize that's a trigger. As soon as they're willing to stoop that low and sell their own brother into slavery, it triggers another change. And God sends them all down into Egyptian slavery. What they do to their younger brother becomes a prediction of what God does with them. So in some ways, you see kind of this almost a restart experience in that place. It's in Egyptian captivity that we first start thinking about Abraham's descendants as Hebrews. Isn't that interesting? We haven't had a name for them, except that these were the sons of Israel, the 12 sons of Israel. Now we have this interesting story. There's an ancient inscription in Egypt, and it talks about the Hapiru people. The Hapirus. And people were like, who are these Hapirus? We don't have any record of Hapirus. And everybody who's a reader of the Bible goes, oh yeah, we do. You know, those were the Hebrew community, just kind of deriving. There were Hebrews and Hyksos. Hyksos were the people of the sea. Hyksos were the Philistines. I find that interesting. Just the last 100 years have brought some of those things to light. This is where Moses enters the biblical story. And, oh gosh, I have just so gotten behind in my slides. I'm sorry. I'm going to catch us up. I want you to think about this slide. Think about this area. It's pretty large. This is all coming from right here in the northeast side of the African continent, right here, Sinai Peninsula, and all these. We think the Garden of Eden existed somewhere in Mesopotamia, right, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, right here. We're not sure, but those are prominently mentioned water sources throughout the context. And so this is where, probably down here, is where the Tower of Babel was built in the Ur of the Chaldees, and we have many ancient towers in that area that were made with these tar bricks that are similar to what we read about. Amazing, amazing finds. And so this area, probably the area of the early patriarchs. Now, can anyone put the land of Israel on the map? It's like right here. It's like this big. It's only 90 miles long and about 60 miles wide at its largest part. It's a very, very small area. And the people, so the patriarchs are in here, they're kind of trying to make a run of it here in the land of promise. And they end up selling their brother down into Egypt. And not just their brother, but they eventually all end up in Egyptian slavery. Remember when they make the Exodus? In the book of Exodus, they come out of Egypt and they cross the Red Sea, probably right here at its most narrow part. They come out and they begin the movement back into the promised land. But they get stuck. They get stuck here in the Syrian desert. It's like maybe they don't have quite the courage to go in and retake the promised land. They're wandering around for 40 years. This was the time that Moses, remember Moses was up on the Mount Sinai? We talked about it earlier today. He comes down and they're worshiping the Egyptian gods again. And it's where we learned that coming out of your captivity, coming out of your slavery happens in layers, right? It happens in layers where you become increasingly willing, you become increasingly well-trained to step out of the things that hold you in bondage, just as the children of Israel did as they wandered around for 40 years. I started freestyling, which is something I promised myself I would not do. I'm sorry. They move from life in captivity to the wilderness wanderings, books of Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Now we'll talk about the Judges. They do come into the land. Remember who leads them into the land? Moses couldn't because he had this nagging failure, so Joshua does. He takes them in, and they fight this battle of Jericho. It's kind of like a landmark battle where they fight and they go in. We could have talked about the spies. Sorry, I'm not going to. They go into the promised land, and they begin to inhabit it. And the promised land is divided up into different tribal sections. So the 12 tribes of Israel, each one gets a certain settlement. Simeon down here, Judah, the tribe that Jesus was from here, the tribe of Dan, the tribe of Ephraim. This is West Manasseh, this is East Manasseh. Gad, Reuben, both of them east of the Jordan River, and then up here, Asher, Naphtali, Zebulun, and Issachar. This right here is the Sea of Galilee, yes? Jesus lived and traveled around Capernaum and Nazareth up here in the Sea of Galilee. This is where they began a movement of discipleship that had not existed before. Jesus chose to live in a place that was emphasizing discipleship, one-on-one teaching of mentors to their students. The Sea of Galilee, you remember, often was a scene where he would meet with the disciples and they would fish. And remember one time, Jesus crosses the sea. There's a huge storm, a dark storm, a foreboding storm. And when he gets over there, he comes upon a man who's inhabited by all these demons. He heals the man, kicks out the demons. And then after that, the man is free. And Jesus says, I want you to go tell the people of your city what the Lord's done for you. Now, do you know what those cities were? Very interesting. They were Philistines. They were Philistine cities, Canaanite cities. Cities of darkness where Jesus was going to invade those places, those strongholds of darkness. Amazing stories about what happened over here on the other side of the lake. Okay, I'm sorry, we got ahead of ourselves. The tribes all divided this space into these 12 separate kind of geographical inheritances. This is the promised land. This is the land flowing with milk and honey, a land with abundant water coming from the Jordan River, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, emptying out into the Dead Sea, a low elevation lake. It was a saltwater lake within the mainland. So incredibly powerful experience as God's people receive the inheritance of the land. This is when the period of Judges begins, because they have all these neighboring people who are attacking them. Edomites, Moabites, Ammonites, Jebusites, Canaanites, Philistines, all in constant war. And there's more than that. I just can't remember. More than that, all fighting. And this is what happens in the book of Judges. Remember, we've learned this Judges cycle. God's people worship idols. They worship the idols of their neighbors. And then God gives them over to their enemies. And God always gives them over to the enemies whose idols they worship. Interesting. The people cry out to God, and God brings salvation by a chosen judge. Or another word would be a deliverer. They have peace during that judge's lifetime, but then when the judge dies, guess what? They go right back to worshiping the idols once again, and the cycle starts anew. I think there's around 11 cycles like this in the book of Judges. It starts to get hard to tell at the end of the book, but it just goes around and around and around and around as the people try to establish their footprint in the promised land. Make sense? So you read those stories about Samson, Gideon, Ehud, Barak, Deborah, and on, all those different judges that we get an opportunity to read about. They get done with the wilderness wandering for 40 years. They come in, and almost immediately, the people begin the judges' cycle. Do you remember what ends the judges' cycle? The people demand a king. They want a king just like all the other nations, don't they? A king to lead them out into battle. And God gives them exactly what they want. He gives them King Saul. He's a head taller than anyone else in the entire nation. He's big. And when he gets on the battlefield, Saul goes berserk. He's an incredible conqueror. And the people love him, right? But Saul begins to erode. And he begins to, he ends up consulting a witch, asking a witch what to do rather than seeking God. And so he erodes, and it gives way for a new king, the new king, David. This is called the united monarchy. The united monarchy just means there's one king over all 12 tribes. The first united monarch was Saul. Second was David. David makes his name by killing the giant Philistine. But he's just the opposite of Saul. He's short. He's young. He's not a big guy. But he also is an incredible protector of Israel. He protects them in multiple battles. They're not fighting as tribal confederates anymore. They're fighting now as a nation as they push their way into and maintain the promised land. But of course, David slips deeply in the area of women. And how many wives did he have? 11 or 13 or something like that. He had a lot of wives. And things just went very badly, especially with his son. Saul lived in very Spartan accommodations. David, not so. David comes and he begins building up all of the supplies necessary for a magnificent temple. So he increases taxation on the people. The people don't like it. David has a son. His son's name's Rehoboam. And the people, when Rehoboam's getting ready to be crowned king, the people say, look, Rehoboam, your father, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Saul, David, and he gives off to Solomon. So Solomon builds this immaculate temple, and the people love it. They're like, he's for us. But he taxed and conscripted lots of labor from them. And then Saul builds an even bigger palace. And the people are like, oh, dude, you just lost it right there. He's conscripting men from all the other tribes to leave their homes and work on these construction projects. People don't like it. And so after Solomon, he has a son, Rehoboam, and the people come to Rehoboam before he is made king, and they say, look, Rehoboam, your dad, he laid a heavy load on us. Lighten our load and we'll follow you. We will. We will. And he says, you think my dad laid a heavy load on you? He said, my little finger's thicker than my father's waist. You know, he's like, I'm gonna make this nation. Oh, I almost said make this nation great. He's gonna increase the nation at the expense of the people. And they say, not on our watch. And so they leave. They leave the Confederacy. There's a civil war. And God's promised land is now divided. It's divided north and south. After the Civil War, there's Israel in the north. It's represented by 10 tribes. And there is Judah, sometimes called Judea, in the south. Judah has only 2 tribes. They war with each other. They get in all kinds of difficulties with each other. They scorn each other. And I'm going to see if I can find my cities. Jerusalem is down here, right there, in Judah. That means if the people in the north want to worship God according to Leviticus, according to Torah, they have to cross the boundary and go into hostile territory. They decide not going to do it, not going down there anymore to worship. And instead, they set up their own shrines in Bethel and Gilgal. I think it might have been, or maybe it's Dan and Gilgal. They set up their own shrines up here, and guess what they decide to worship? Golden calves. Once again, they set up these calves up there. They're going to worship the calves in the north, and they're going to let people continue to worship in the Temple of Jerusalem down south. So it's just an amazing turn of events as these things begin to transpire. I mean, the Promised Land is now divided, this sacred space that God had promised to Abraham way back. There have only been 3 kings of the United Kingdom: Saul, David, and Solomon. Now there are dual kings residing in the north and 1 king residing in the south. Wow. This is a time that represented tremendous prosperity in Israel. Do you know why? It's because people couldn't travel. The only way you could travel down to Egypt from up in Mesopotamia was by going near this route, because that's where the water was. Otherwise, you just dry out, die of thirst. You couldn't walk in the desert. You can see where the desert starts, just right over here. And so the Jewish community, whenever you would take your caravan of goods down to Egypt to sell in the Egyptian markets, or when the Egyptians would take their goods up to sell in Mesopotamia and Syria and all those northern communities, they would give you a little tax. You'd go by and you'd pay a little tax, and they became wealthy and powerful here in the Levant, here in this well-watered, fertile area that comes just to the west of the Syro-Arabian desert. It was a period of prosperity. It was a period of peace. Judah had a king named Jeroboam II in the north. Israel in the north had Jeroboam II, and there was Uzziah in the south. And so unprecedented peace and prosperity. And in that moment, right then, something new began to emerge that we've never seen before, called the writing prophets. They were the prophets that came, and their message was so poignant that people actually began to write it down. Up in the north, there was Amos and Hosea. Amos and Hosea spoke to the north kingdom. Down in the south, there was Micah and Isaiah. They spoke in the south to the people there. And they had 4 terrifying messages. They were all the same. What they said is the cup of God's wrath is about to be poured out on you. The cup of God's wrath is full, and it's about to overflow. Isaiah 10:5, it says that Assyria, it says this interesting statement. It said, Assyria, God's going to make Assyria the club of his wrath, as his wrath is poured out on all people. This is a picture of the Assyrian Empire. The world had never seen anything like this before. There were lots of kingdoms before this, kingdoms with individual kings. Assyria was an empire. You understand the difference? An empire is a place where they conquer kings and kingdoms, and they absorb them. They bring them all together in this giant empire. First they conquer you, and then they force your men to join the army, and then you force those people to help conquer the nation right next to you, and they just creep out from their central spot, gathering more and more nations into this gigantic empire. So look at the size of this thing. Here's the Dead Sea. Recognize all of the Promised Land is like this wide. Very small. The Assyrians were incredibly cruel. So let's say that you had a group of guys, good fighters, and they resisted in your town for a little while when the Assyrian troops came in to beat them down. They take those guys out and they stick them on a pole. And then they plant the pole right outside the city gates along the main road. So as you walked into the Assyrian capital, you walked into Nineveh, you would have to walk through this road with people, warriors from other countries, their bodies decaying on these poles as you walked in. It was quite a formidable sight. They reigned with terror. They reigned with all kinds of scare tactics. They were the world's first terrorists. The king who's most responsible for this movement in Assyria, his name was Tiglath-Pileser. So Tiglath-Pileser, you know Tiglath? Yeah, I know Tiglath. He has another name now, but we know where he's at. Tiglath-Pileser would demand, let me tell you a little bit more. He had a nickname, Pul, P-U-L. I don't know where he got it, and I don't know what it means. But you will read about Pul in, I think, the book of 1 Kings. I can't remember, but it actually references this particular guy. He had a 3-stage plan. He's the one who came up with the 3-stage plan. He would demand tribute from the kings of the target nation. He said, look, I need tribute. It was a huge amount of money. It was a yearly payment. It was an extortion, or it was a bribe that he called protection money. Of course, he was protecting them from himself. And so that was his plan, kind of for conquest. And then there was a second part to the plan. The target nation, the moment you didn't pay them enough or the moment you refused to make that tribute payment, he would bring in his army and do various cruel acts. First, he would kill 80% or take 80% of the country, and he would convert your country into an Assyrian state. You didn't get to run your own government anymore. You didn't get to have your own military. He would install his own military, install his own government. And when I said that he deported the people, that's not what happened to most of them. A lot of them just died. Then he would set up an Assyrian puppet king. So he'd just go around to the guys and he'd say, hey, will you do exactly what I tell you if you become the king of this country? Exactly what you're told to do? And if the guy said, no, I really won't, he'd cut their head off. But if you said, yeah, I'll follow your plans exactly, then he'd make you very wealthy. And you'd come in and you get to be the king. It's a puppet king. Yeah. Stage 3. When you responded negatively towards stage 2, stage 3 was total destruction. They would wipe your cities off the face of the map. They would pull down every brick on top of every other brick in your city. And then they would resettle your city and your towns, your nation. They'd resettle it with people that they were bringing in from all the other conquered nations, so that there wouldn't be this strong nationalism anymore. You'd bring them in from many different places, you'd resettle. And there would, of course, be some people who weren't killed in the destruction, and they would intermarry. They would become a part of the resettlement package. This is where the Samaritans came from. When they invaded the North Kingdom, they made it to stage 3 pretty quick. The Assyrians wiped them off the face of the map, and they resettled the North Kingdom, Israel, with all kinds of different immigrants, and they were intermarrying with the Israelites who had lived there before, and that's where we get the Samaritans. The Jewish people hated the Samaritans. They felt like they were half-breeds because they hadn't maintained their purity. Of course, Jesus loved Samaritans. He has this incredible interaction with a Samaritan woman by the well, and then he speaks this really favorable parable about a Samaritan that he calls the Good Samaritan, right? Who helps out a man in need. And so it's just a little story of how Assyria impacted the entire narrative of the Bible. These guys were the Borg. They just grabbed everything. Here, I've got some words from Amos 4. This is right during the time of Assyrian conquest. This is Amos. He's one of the writing prophets. It's his accusation and condemnation against the people of Israel before the Assyrians swept in. He said, hear this word, you cows of Bashan on Mount Samaria. Yikes. You women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and say to your husbands, bring us some drinks. The sovereign Lord has sworn in his holiness, the time will surely come when you will be taken away with hooks, the last of you with fish hooks. You will each go straight out through the breaches in the wall. In other words, they're going to break down the wall, and they're going to get the most wealthy ladies in that culture, and they're going to drag them out with hooks. You'll be cast out toward Harmon. Here, he says, go to Bethel and sin, go to Gilgal and sin yet more. Those were the two places where they were worshiping the golden calves. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 years. Burn leavened bread and thank offering and brag about your free will offerings. Boast about them, you Israelites, for this is what you love to do, declares the sovereign Lord. And so God uses Pul, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. And he destroys that place because father and son were using the same girl. Remember that from 2 weeks ago? Because they trampled on the heads of the poor and they sold the destitute for silver because they've worshiped the Baals in Bethel and Gilgal. So the southern kingdom now stands alone, right? Assyria's up to the top. They have wiped Israel off the face of the map. And the south kingdom, the two tribes, they now stand alone. And you might kind of be tempted, when I kind of first learned this, you might be tempted to say, well, thank goodness that God still had the faithful southern kingdom with all of the temple and all those priests and them doing all this really God stuff. But the truth is the faithful south was growing increasingly godless and reprobate itself. Things look really bad for the south. It looks like Assyria is going to come in and take the south as well. Then comes Hezekiah, the great king of the south, who leads this country in a revival. Hezekiah, he was the king of Judah from 715 to 687. Oh, the north was wiped off the face of the map at 722 BC. Hezekiah came just a little bit later, and I want to read from 2 Kings 18. It says, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke to pieces the bronze snake Moses had made, for up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. They made an idol out of the bronze snake. It was called Nehushtan. Hezekiah trusted the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among the kings of Judah. Either before him or after him, he held fast to the Lord and did not stop following him. He kept the commands of the Lord and the Lord had given Moses. So Hezekiah, he calls the people back to God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He encourages all these people so that God's fierce anger would turn away from them. And he also, guess what? He also built new fortifications. So he's reaching out to God, but he's also increasing the strength of the walls. He built this tunnel so that they could get fresh water without leaving the city, so that fresh water could come in and these Assyrians could come and assault them, but he's drinking, they had fresh water to drink. Well, at this time, the king of Assyria was named Sennacherib, and he sees all this and he's like, oh, they are planning to go at it. They're not just going to give in. They're escalating the stakes. The stakes are going sky high. So here's this passage in 2 Chronicles. It blows my mind. It records a letter from the king of Assyria to Hezekiah. This is from Sennacherib to Hezekiah. He says, this is what Sennacherib, king of Assyria, says. On what are you basing your confidence that you remain in Jerusalem under siege? When Hezekiah says the Lord our God will save us from the hand of the king of Assyria, he's misleading you to let you die of hunger and thirst. He's saying we're going to cut off the food supply. Did not Hezekiah himself remove this God's places and his altars, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, you must worship before one altar and burn sacrifices on it? So he's using his purification of the people against him. Do you not know what I and my predecessors have done to all the peoples of the other lands where the gods of those nations were they ever able to deliver their land from my hand? Who of all the gods of these nations that my predecessors destroyed have now been able to save his people from me? How can you and your God deliver from my hand? Now, do not let Hezekiah deceive you and mislead you like this. Do not believe him, for no God of any nation or kingdom has been able to deliver its people from my hand or from the hand of my predecessors. How much less will your God deliver you from my hand? So Hezekiah goes, he attacks Judea, 46 cities fall. Jerusalem is one of the few that remain. He doesn't break through there. And it's an amazing story. He had removed all the Baals. He had removed all the idols. all the temples, all the other detestable things that had gone on. Yeah. Pressing on. That was the nation of Assyria. They didn't quite take the capital of Judea. After Assyria, a second, much larger empire emerges. Babylon, right? So Babylon begins the same process. They conquer Assyria, and then they conquer additional lands all throughout the Levant, the Fertile Crescent. This is the Fertile Crescent. You can kind of see the Fertile Crescent and what they destroyed, all the way into Egypt down here, all the way up past Syria up here, almost to Turkey. Babylon is an enormous empire. It's led by a number of different kings, and they have kind of the same strategy. They run the same offense that Assyria ran. And now they're the ones who are pressing in on the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom has grown rich during the time between Assyria and Babylon, and they have also grown increasingly corrupt. It's an incredible story. Josiah's reforms weren't enough. There's a king named Josiah. He tries to purify the nation in the same way that Hezekiah did. But it isn't enough. He decides to stop paying tribute to King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And so King of Babylon attacks Jerusalem, the southern kingdom. He defeats it in 587 BC. It's an absolute, it's like a critical year to remember as you think about the biblical narrative. There were no additional towns to support Jerusalem. They'd all been wiped off the face of the map by Syria earlier. They couldn't come to Jerusalem's aid. The temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar as he invaded Jerusalem. They took all the temple articles, all the plates, all the service well, all the gold and silver objects are taken by the king of Nebuchadnezzar. They are the treasures of God's people, and he brought them into his own land. An enormous amount of biblical material comes from what's called the Babylonian captivity. He came in 3 waves, dragging more people back to Babylon every single time. He started with the most educated and those who had the highest skill levels, taking them, stealing them, pushing them into slavery. And then he took a second set, and then a third set. You may recognize that first set, the finest of the fine young men. Remember who went during that time? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. They were going to be liaisons and counselors to the king of Babylon because of their great knowledge and understanding. Psalm 137, it's an example of the biblical material that came out of this Babylonian exile experience. They said, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while we're in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I don't remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to the foundations. Daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you've done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. The entire book of Lamentations is a similar portrayal of the emotions those people experienced when they were hauled out of their homeland into Babylonian captivity. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego framed for not bowing down to the 90-foot high gold image Daniel framed, thrown into the lion's den because he prayed in public. So the final story of Babylon comes when he throws this huge party. And he brings out all the gold and silver items from the temple. And he's going to make a mockery of Yahweh, the God of Israel, by serving his dinner of debauchery on their gold and silver items. And something happens. Handwriting appears on the wall. Right? You remember this? Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. And it means something like, you have been found in the scales wanting. You have been found in the scales wanting, and all you have will be ripped from you. I can't remember the exact interpretation. I should have written it down. Because the Persians conquer the Babylonians in 539. So they were taken into Babylonian captivity starting in 589. But now an even larger nation, the empire of Persia, look at the size of this thing. I mean, you almost can't see the promised land. It's so small by comparison. Persia just dominates everything, all the way over here from Mesopotamia, up clear across Turkey, clear across Asia Minor, up into what we would think of as the centers of the Roman Empire, and then down here through Egypt. Every place that was inhabitable. Remember his name? I'm sorry. You may remember his name. I don't. I thought I had it in mind. Cyrus the Great. And the Bible mentions Cyrus the Great. I just want to read a little bit from Isaiah 45. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus. God's calling Cyrus an anointed one. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of and subdue nations before him, to strip kings of their armor, to open doors before him so that gates will not be shut. I will go before you. He's saying this to a foreign king. I will go before you and will level the mountains and break down the gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron. I will give you hidden treasures, riches stored in secret places, so that you may know that I am the Lord, the God of Israel, who summons you by name. God's going to use this guy. And Cyrus gets God's people, drags them into Persia, where they are now captive to them the way they had been to Babylon. But what's the difference with Cyrus? Do you remember? He lets the people go back. So he doesn't run the same game plan. He lets people go back to their indigenous homelands. And he decides he's just going to tax them in their homes rather than force them to be enslaved in his homeland. It's a different strategy. So he lets them return home. You may remember Nehemiah. He had become the governor of Judea under Cyrus, king of Persia. And Nehemiah, somehow he gets free, and he goes and walks around the promised land, and he sees the terrible conditions, and he asks at this time it was King Artaxerxes, sorry, it changed a little. He asks Artaxerxes for permission, for money to build a defensive wall around the homeland, around Judah, and he says yes. It's an exciting story. Nehemiah goes down to Jerusalem. He builds this wall, and he's constantly kind of pushing back these warlords from that same area, working hard to build the wall. After Ezra, we read the story of Nehemiah. Oh, I'm sorry, Ezra was the scribe. Nehemiah rebuilds the wall. I'm sorry. Ezra comes back and rebuilds the temple. And so you see, they're starting over in the promised land. It's right on. We're back to Eden, back to God's space. They have a wall around them that Nehemiah built. They have the temple that Ezra built. They kick off new sacrifices. But I don't know if you remember, there's great ambivalence with this new Judea. And it's because the people remember the temple in its heyday. And it says some of them wept while others rejoiced. And so it was a mixed bag, and it remains a mixed bag among the people. There's a great sense in which the restoration of Judah never really takes off. It never really develops. It never really emerges or grows. Who came next? Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire, the Hellenistic age, the Greco-Roman period. Alexander the Great conquers the known world in the West, everything. And it says when he got to the place where there were no more city, he wept because he wanted to conquer more. The children of Israel are able to remain in their homes. They pay tribute, but they are slaves. And Alexander, when he dies, he has 5 generals. The 2 that operated in Judea were Ptolemy and Seleucus. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids. I believe the Ptolemies were the peace-loving ones. The Seleucids were warlike. So they end up taking everything away from the Ptolemies later on. And they end up taking the country. They're horribly cruel. And you even wonder if Israel is going to survive. That's what some of the books I've read said. You began to wonder if they were just going to wipe them completely off the face of the map. But it isn't too long before there's even a greater power that comes in. Rome. They take everything, and they leave no prisoners. They'll let you stay in your town, but they want you to become Romans. They want you to adopt the value system of Rome. They want you to worship the Roman Caesar and act as if he is God, and they demand these kinds of things, or they lay waste to your little world, and they do so happily. And of course, this is exactly when Jesus comes on the scene. Jesus comes on the scene, and there are still Roman garrisons, Roman soldiers, there are Roman tax collectors. He interacts with Roman governors who are in that province to keep the peace for the larger Roman government. The people are kind of free, but they're kind of not free because he taxes them so deeply that they almost cannot sustain themselves. He taxes them to the point of insustainability. And Jesus is there in this place, in the place where people are being asked to say, over and over, they're asked to say, Caesar is Lord, and that's where his mission begins during the Roman government. It's an absolutely profound story, and I have 4 minutes left to make my time limit. We hurried through some of the last stuff. The things that really affect me when I see this are how tiny, just how very, very small the promised land is compared to these enormous empires of the world. It helps me recognize that it was never God's plan to dominate the world in the same way kings and emperors of this earth plan to dominate. His plan was to plant a little seed that would grow up to become a great tree in which the birds could make their nests. His plan was that it would be a church, a community within a nation, that he would have his kingship in every tribe and tongue and nation in order that there would be this light in the darkness. There would be this saltiness in a place that has no preservation. There would be kingdoms of God within the kingdoms of men. And look at what God did. Because when he brought the Roman Empire, guess what? Everything in red, all those people spoke the same language. They spoke Greek. So if you had a missionary who could speak Greek, he could travel all the way around through here, through Asia Minor, through Turkey, all the way through the Roman Empire into Italy. He could go all the way to Gaul and Spain, and people could understand the language that missionary was speaking. Oh, guess what? The Romans had this incredible thing called the Roman road system. It covered the entire area you see outlined in red. So all of a sudden, people like Paul could walk everywhere they went. They had this thing called the Pax Romana, and the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome, made it illegal for these small communities, all these small nations that had dotted the Mediterranean Sea. They had to live at peace with one another. You couldn't start fights between another tribe or another nation. If you did, Rome would come in and flatten your city. So there was great peace. There were Roman roads, and there was a common language system. And God brought Jesus at just a time when his followers could travel all over the world, and they could share this new message of a king who wanted his kingdom to emerge in every nation, every tribe, and every people group. It's an amazing story of orchestration, how God used all these things together for the good of his kingdom and the good of his people. So this is the story of the people who were the forerunners of our faith. And it's the story of how God used all these enormous empires and powerful, narcissistic, proud leaders in order to bring his kingdom on earth as in heaven, on earth in little pockets of Christ followers throughout every tribe, tongue, and nation of the world. That's it. 4, 3, 2, 1. You're free to go.